Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep with these horror stories from Dangerous Liaisons. So, before we start, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave me a comment. When you're ready, make yourself comfortable and relax. This happened in 2017 when the app Tinder was at its peak. I remember that all my friends had downloaded it and were on the hunt for romance, or rather one-night stands. Being the curious type, I decided to jump in at the deep end and see what the fuss was all about. But I have to admit, I had no idea how it worked, so I called my friend Samael, who was an expert in this kind of thing, to give me a hand. When I got to his place, my friends got down to business. They took photos of me and started creating my profile. It was as if they were preparing a big show. Sam was especially excited and told me that they were setting me up on a blind date so that I could finally enjoy a fun night out. The date was scheduled for Monday, and I was encouraged to wear something eye-catching, so I opted for a red shirt that looked good on me. The chosen place was a pizzeria near my house, so it suited me perfectly. Finally, the day arrived. And when I arrived, the tension in my stomach was crazy. I was nervous and anxious to meet my date. I sat at a table at the back, looking at the entrance, trying to visualize what the girl I was going to meet would be like. But several minutes passed, and to my surprise, no one came in. As I tried to calm down, a guy approached and said my name. I turned in his direction, a little confused. I didn't know the guy, so I was intrigued that he called me by my name. He smiled, and with a nervous smile, he told me his name was Ashton and that he was my date. I was speechless for a moment, confused and somewhat taken aback. So I explained that I was expecting a girl called Emily, but he, with a mischievous look, took out his phone and showed me the profile that my friends had created. Instead of Tinder, they had subscribed me to another application called Grindr, an app for dating between men. At that moment, I was stunned, and quickly anger overwhelmed me. How could they do this to me? All I wanted was to go back and smash their faces in, especially Samael's. I tried to calm down a bit and told the guy that my friends had played a cruel joke on me and it was all a misunderstanding, but the situation quickly became uncomfortable when Ashton got angry and started to get aggressive. I didn't come all this way just to make a fool of myself. I'm nobody's puppet, he said as he approached. I tried to reason with him and apologized for the whole thing, emphasizing that I had also been made fun of. But at one point in our discussion, with a now deeper and more threatening voice, he suggested that I at least do him a favor, in the bathroom, as compensation for having made him come on a fake date. I was taken aback by the request. What the hell was wrong with this guy? At that moment, my patience snapped. Are you crazy? I told you I'm not gay, I don't like men, and this was just a really bad joke from my friends. He tried to make a move towards me, but I punched him and ran for the exit. I went straight to my apartment and started calling the idiots I had as friends, but none of them answered. They must have been dying with laughter at the joke they played on me, and they probably knew why I was calling them. An hour later, while I was still furious about that ridiculous situation, I was walking down the street on my way to Samael's house to give him what he deserved, when suddenly Ashton appeared again. I tried to ignore him and continued on my way. To cut across to Sam's house, I usually took a shortcut through a narrow, lonely alleyway between two buildings under construction. So I went in there hoping to lose Ashton, who was still a few meters behind me, even though I had already told him to leave me alone. However, he followed me to that place, and I soon realized that he was not alone. A guy had joined him at some point without me realizing it. I tried to play it down and moved on, but after I had walked a short distance, the guy cornered me and hit me hard from behind, taking me by surprise and leaving me dazed. Before I could react, he came at me, making his intentions even clearer. I was trapped, and I felt I had no way out. Suddenly, both men grabbed me by the arms and slammed me face first against the wall, a blow that left me dizzy and almost broke my nose. At that moment, the two of them immobilized me, and while the guy who was with Ashton held my arms behind my back and kept me pinned against the wall, Ashton started to unbutton my belt, trying to pull down my pants. At that moment, I realized what he was trying to do, and I started to struggle with all my might. I begged them both not to do it, that I would give them my wallet, my phone, and anything else of value I had, but please let me go. However, their response was to laugh mockingly and evilly, and suddenly Ashton positioned himself behind me, came close to my ear, and with his disgusting voice said to me, "Relax, it won't hurt." And then they both started laughing again. At that moment, he finally finished unfastening my belt and yanked down my pants, along with my underwear. My eyes opened wide, feeling completely vulnerable and terrified. Were they really going to do this to me? I started to struggle again and kick, trying to get away from their grip, but there were two of them, and they were stronger than me. So after punching me a couple of times in the stomach and hitting my ankles with their boots, they threw me to the ground, where Ashton's friend punched me in the face, almost knocking me out. Then he sat on my back so I couldn't move while Ashton struggled to make him stop kicking and moving my legs. I was crying, completely desperate and terrified, and I started screaming for help as loud as I could. Being in that situation was the most terrifying, desperate, and humiliating thing I've ever gone through in my life. But just when I thought I was lost, I started to hear screams in the distance. Male voices shouting, "Let him go!" and footsteps running in our direction. At that moment, Ashton let out a curse, and he and his friend finally let me go and ran away, fleeing the scene. I lay on the pavement, crying out of fear or desperation or relief. I wouldn't know how to explain the jumble of mixed emotions I felt at that moment, but I got up and pulled up my trousers to see an older man approaching with two younger guys who had tubes in their hands. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" they asked me, to which I replied, shaking my head in denial. But at that moment I felt blood running down my mouth and a stabbing pain in my face. My nose was broken. The men helped me to my feet. Then they put me in their car and took me to the police station. There I gave my statement and made the complaint, but not before thanking these men for helping me and saving me from something horrible. They turned out to be a father and his two sons, who were driving down the street. One of the boys heard me screaming and, looking down the alley, came upon the horrible scene and alerted the others. I was so grateful to them for having taken the trouble to come to the aid of a stranger. It made me renew my faith in humanity. But as for my friends, the situation was very different. When I checked my phone, I realized that I had several missed calls from them, but I didn't bother to answer. That night, they came to my apartment to find out how my date had gone and probably to make fun of me. But when they saw the state I was in and heard what had happened to me, their faces changed from mockery to horror. At one point, I just walked up to Samael and without saying a word, I punched him in the nose. "Now we're even," I said, and then I kicked them all out of my house. Several of them tried to contact me, apologizing for what had happened, but frankly, I didn't want to have anything to do with any of them, and to this day, I have not spoken to them again. Fortunately, Ashton and his friend were arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison for assault and attempted rape. A few months later, I decided to move back to my hometown with my parents and continue my studies at the local university. Since then, I have not heard anything from any of my former friends. With friends like them, nobody needs enemies. I know that maybe I am being too resentful and that perhaps nothing that happened with Ashton was intentional on their part. But nobody knows what I went through, and frankly, I cannot see them again without remembering that all that horror was their fault. My friends have always been insistent, and that night was no exception. They invited me to a party, and although I didn't feel like going out, I knew that if I didn't accept, they would start to think that I was avoiding them. I didn't want them to think that, so I finally decided to go with them. Besides, maybe I needed a change of scenery. Sammy, Diana, and Pink always said that I was locking myself away too much and that I needed to live a little. And maybe they were right, although I wouldn't admit it out loud. The party was in a fairly well-known club in the city, a place I had never liked. I don't like the deafening noise, the smell of alcohol mixed with sweat, or the feeling of being surrounded by strangers. I would much rather stay at home in my room. that little refuge that my mother left me before she passed away. I have never been a party person, but that night, for some reason, I decided to give them a chance. Maybe it was the tiredness of being alone, or maybe I just wanted to try something new and see if I liked it, although I think in the end I just succumbed to peer pressure. When we arrived at the club, the atmosphere was overwhelming. It was as stressful as I thought it would be. The music was pounding in my ears and the flashing lights disoriented me, not to mention the smell of alcohol and cigarettes. My friends immediately immersed themselves in the crowd, dancing and laughing like there was no tomorrow. They were like fish in water, but I, on the other hand, stayed behind, observing everything and feeling totally out of place. But then something changed. I don't know if it was the rhythm of the music, the energy of the place that gradually seeped into my veins, or the cocktails I was drinking, but suddenly I found myself moving to the beat of the electronic music, letting the sound envelop me. It was a strange, liberating feeling, as if for the first time in months I was allowing myself to feel something other than sadness. It was then that I saw him. A tall, blonde guy with intense eyes who approached me, making his way through the crowd. He didn't say anything, he just started dancing in front of me. His movements were fluid and sexy, almost hypnotic to me. So without realizing it, I let myself be carried away by the moment. By that point, I had already had a few cocktails and felt strangely uninhibited. So without a shred of embarrassment, my hands found their way to their body, and theirs ran along mine. It was as if the world around us had disappeared, and meanwhile, my friends were watching me from afar, smiling with satisfaction, as if they were proud to see me living the life, as they said. After a while, the guy took me by the hand and led me to a quieter corner of the club. We ordered a drink, and although I don't usually drink that much, that night I decided to make an exception and let myself go a little. The cocktails were sweet and relaxing, and the company was even more intoxicating. We talked for a long time, we laughed, and at some point the conversation became a little more intimate. After a while, he asked me if I wanted to go to his place or if I preferred to go to mine. The idea seemed exciting, dangerous. I had never done anything like this before, so I found the proposal very exciting, so without thinking twice, I agreed. The sexy guy and I left the club together, holding hands. I don't remember how we got to my house, I just know it was an impulsive decision and I wasn't quite myself. My neighbor saw us enter my apartment, and although I noticed a disapproving look in her eyes, I didn't care. I was living in the moment, something I hadn't done in a long time. Once inside, everything was a whirlwind of passion. I simply lost myself in the heat of the moment, and for the first time in months I felt alive. But when I woke up the next morning, reality hit me like a speeding train. I was alone in my bed and fully clothed, as if nothing had happened. The room was spotless, with no sign that anyone other than me had been there. I got out of bed feeling disoriented, and I searched the whole house, but there was no sign of him, or anyone else. Everything was in its place, impeccable, just as I had left it the night before going out. At that moment, I was overcome with panic. What the hell was going on here? Had I imagined everything? Was it possible that alcohol had played such a cruel trick on me? My head was spinning, and I had a throbbing pain between my eyes that didn't help me think clearly. After drinking a glass of water, I ran out to look for my neighbor, who had seen us come in the night before. I knocked on her door in desperation and asked if she had seen the boy leave my apartment, but she looked at me in disbelief and shook her head. "You didn't come with anyone, Ruth," she said. "You arrived alone, staggering and talking to nothing." "So there wasn't a guy with me?" I asked her with horror in my eyes, but she shook her head and reaffirmed that I had arrived home alone. I couldn't believe it. I immediately went back to my apartment, picked up my cell phone and called Sammy, hoping she would give me some explanation. But she only confirmed what my neighbor had said. According to her, I had gotten drunk at the club, started dancing very sensually on the dance floor, then sat in a corner talking and laughing to myself, and finally decided to leave on my own, talking about a sexy guy and having a crazy night. My eyes went as big as saucers and I felt very embarrassed. She told me they were worried, but they thought I would get home safely as I only lived a couple of blocks away. I sat on my sofa with my head spinning, completely baffled. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before. So had it all been a hallucination? A fantasy fueled by alcohol and loneliness? Sometimes I think it was a dream, a fantasy my mind created to escape reality. Other times I wonder if that boy really existed, if he was really there. What confused me was that it had all felt very real, very vivid, and that terrified me. But the most terrifying thing happened a couple of weeks later. Diana invited us to her house for a girls' afternoon, and seeing that it wasn't a club or any kind of night party, I accepted. When I got to her house, we were relaxing in her living room eating snacks and chatting, when suddenly a photo on a shelf in her living room caught my attention. In it, you could see a blonde, handsome guy in a green t-shirt holding a surfboard. The shelf was a few meters away, so I couldn't make out the image very well, but it caught my attention so much that I stood up and went over to take a closer look. And as I did, my heart sank. It was him, the handsome guy from the club. I was completely paralyzed, and at that moment I heard Diana's voice behind me. He was very handsome, wasn't he? I turned to her immediately. Was he, you said? Yes, his name was Peter. He was my older brother. He died in a car accident last year. At that moment I felt my heart stop. I don't know how I didn't faint from the shock. Seeing my horrified face, she asked me if something was wrong, and although I was tempted to tell her, I preferred not to, mainly because I didn't know how she would take it. By that point, the club incident was already behind me, like a funny anecdote, and I didn't want to bring it up again, especially not in such a sinister way. However, I felt so bad after that I made up an excuse to the girls about having left the kitchen tap on, and I quickly got out of there. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. I don't know if I had a close encounter of the third kind with the ghost of my friend's deceased brother, or if it was all just a hallucination with someone who looked a lot like him. All I know is that I will never again let myself be led by my friends, and I will never take another drink of alcohol for the rest of my life. Every year, my friend Carl and I would take that trip to his grandparents' cabin in a small town lost in the mountains of Georgia. For us, those getaways are always a feast of fresh air and nature, and we always have a great time. The idea is to relax, enjoy ourselves, and above all, have a little adventure. However, there is one story that I will always remember from that place. One night, we had the bright idea of going for a night walk along a nearby trail. At first I didn't want to, as this wasn't an easy path. It was a gravel trail, used mainly by hunters and some campers, and occasionally also by thrill-seeking motorcyclists, so I didn't think it was too prudent, as we didn't know it. But in the end, Carl convinced me. So after dinner, we decided to explore the trail. He more enthusiastic than I, but I supposed it would be fun. However, when we arrived at the trailhead, we came across something unexpected. There was an old black Chevy SUV which looked like it had seen better days, and next to it were two middle-aged guys who had a suspicious attitude. It was not very common to see a car with those characteristics in this area, and even less so in that place, so I immediately got a bad feeling. Although the area is usually safe, there were rumors that some criminal groups were using the forest to traffic illicit substances. Without thinking about it too much, we decided it was best to avoid any kind of problem and opted for a different path, one that was half a mile away from the danger we had seen. So we parked our Jeep and ventured along a path further away from any possible dangerous encounter. At first, everything was perfect. The fresh air, the sound of the night, and the stars shining above. But after walking for a while, we began to hear a persistent dog barking from a point not too far away. About 300 feet away, the sound grew louder and louder, and that caught our attention. The idea of a dog barking at that hour and in the middle of nowhere scared us a little. We didn't know if it was tied up or loose, and we were afraid that if it was free it might lunge at us. I mean, it could be a wild dog and that's dangerous, so I told Carl that maybe it would be better to come back and do this another day. He didn't totally agree at first, but in the end he saw reason and realized that it was for the best, so we went back to the Jeep. However, as we were returning, about 1,000 feet from our vehicle, we noticed something that made our blood run cold. Another car was parked right behind Carl's Jeep with its lights on. At that moment, we were overcome with panic. Imagine, it was almost 10 o'clock at night, and there was a car there, on a lonely path, next to our car. It was like a bad feeling that we couldn't ignore. We remained silent for about 5 minutes, trying to see if there was anyone inside. Everything was dark, but there was a large tree that provided us with a discreet hiding place. Once we were well hidden, Carl took out some night vision binoculars he had brought with him, but we couldn't make out much. The feeling of being watched was unsettling, so we decided to stay there and wait for the car to leave. We were afraid to go back, and that it might be dangerous people. After what seemed like an eternity, the car began to move slowly and circled our truck as if it were looking for us. This was definitely suspicious, and in a fit of nerves, we slipped behind a log on a small hill. It was a moment of pure adrenaline, and just then the same black Chevy we had seen at the beginning passed by again just a few meters from us, unaware of how close we were. The windows were down, and the guy was driving slowly, as if trying to see around us. Seeing their faces sent shivers down my spine. These guys really looked dangerous, and I had no doubt that they didn't have good intentions. The men took a second lap, this time passing even closer, and at that moment I felt my heart was about to jump out of my chest. Carl was also holding his breath, filled with panic. We were both terrified at the idea that these guys might decide to get out of the car and come to investigate. Clinging to the hope that they would go away, we were lucky that they finally continued on their way and disappeared. As soon as they left, we came out of our hiding place, grateful that fate had given us a second chance. Carl and I ran with all our might back to the Jeep, still trembling with fear and confusion. The adrenaline was making our hearts race. We couldn't stop thinking about the car that had appeared out of nowhere, and those scruffy-looking guys, and we had no idea what they were looking for, or even if they were looking for us at all. Days later, Carl and his grandfather decided to return to the place during the day. Carl wanted to take some photos and show his grandfather the place where we had had that terrifying experience. I decided not to accompany them. I really didn't feel like going back there. To my surprise, they returned much sooner than I expected, but when they arrived, I noticed that they were somewhat nervous, and I asked them what had happened. It was then that they told me that when they were approaching the place, they noticed the same truck from the night before parked in the same place, and when they noticed its presence, the driver started the car, and they began to follow them. Fortunately, Carl's grandfather knows those woods like the back of his hand, and he took a shortcut that few people know, managing to lose them. I couldn't sleep that night. I was terrified that those guys could track us back to the cabin. For that reason, I decided to pack up the next day and go back to the city. I suggested to Carl and his grandfather that they do the same, at least for a few days, but they decided to stay. Fortunately, nothing bad happened, and both he and his grandfather remained in the area without incident. A few months later, they told me that a state commission had arrived and managed to capture several members of a criminal organization dedicated to drug trafficking, which had been carrying out its operations in that area. Luckily, after that, they never had any more incidents of that kind. A year later, I returned with Carl and his grandfather to the cabin, and I continue to do so every year. But that incident always remained in my memory as one of the most terrifying things I have ever experienced. It was a summer's night, and the atmosphere was charged with excitement as I and a group of friends from university ventured off to camp in the forest. Our plan was to stay for a couple of days, exploring and enjoying the great outdoors. We set off for a walk, unaware that this expedition would turn into a spine-chilling experience we would never forget. It all started as we were returning to our camp. As we walked back along the path, I noticed the silhouette of a man peering around a dark corner. He looked disheveled, with a lost look in his eyes, as if he had just emerged from a back alley. I reassured myself that he was probably just drunk and let him pass. However, there was something about the way he moved that left me with an unsettling feeling. There were 7 of us in total at the camp, and among us there were 2 emergency doctors whom we will call Tom and Lucia. We decided to set up camp near a small jetty that seemed ideal for our nights under the stars. The first night passed without incident, as we sat around the campfire exchanging stories, laughter, and jokes, while the light from the fire illuminated our faces and the aroma of grilled sausages filled the air. Around midnight, as the darkness thickened, I noticed something curious. Suddenly, a reddish flash appeared behind a distant hill, flickering briefly before disappearing. I mentioned it out loud, but my friends didn't seem to have seen it. I tried to play it down, thinking it might be the reflection of a light filter in the sky or something like that. But deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. One of the guys, Mike, suggested it might be an emergency flare. At first we all seemed to agree that we shouldn't worry too much, but curiosity began to grow. We decided that if we saw another flare, some of us would go and investigate. Tom and Lucia were more than willing to accompany us, ready with their medical kit in case anyone really needed help. A few minutes passed, and just as we were about to leave the campfire, a new reddish flash appeared in the west, much closer than the previous one. Now it was clear that we needed to act, so we split into teams, and Mike and I, along with Tom and another colleague, headed toward the direction of the light, while Lucia and the others would stay at the camp to be on alert. We got into Tom's rustic truck and headed for the place, trying to be careful, as the road was a bit treacherous. After driving a little further, we stopped at a rocky area. We took out our torches, illuminating the surroundings, and shouted repeatedly, but only the echo answered us. Everything was empty, with no sign of life, but there was a strange feeling in the air, as if something were watching us from the shadows. After a while of fruitless searching, we suddenly heard a bang. Mike had realized that one of the tires on the passenger side had blown. As we inspected the damage, I noticed something atypical. A sharp object sticking out of the gravel, as if someone had intentionally left it there. The wheel was a mess, and although we tried to change it, what should have been an easy job turned into an uphill struggle. The nuts were too tight, as if they had been welded on, and one of them seemed to have been tampered with. While everyone was trying to change the tire, I heard a noise coming from the thick darkness that made me turn my head around and draw my pistol, illuminating the mist with my flashlight. What I saw left me frozen. A large rock had fallen from one of the nearby hills and had come to rest just 10 feet from me. My heart raced, but I quickly realized that there was no one in the vicinity. My friends started to make fun of me, telling me that I was becoming too paranoid. However, a heavy feeling settled over me, suggesting to me that something was definitely not right. I laughed at them, but inside I knew that the situation had deviated from the usual. I felt that there was a latent danger in the air, although I said nothing to avoid their nonsense. We tried to raise our spirits, joking about how disastrous our trip was. Then, just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, a flare shot up into the sky, illuminating the ravine where we had started the search. The light shone brightly before falling back to the ground, and once again, we found ourselves in an atmosphere of eerie silence. "This is weird," I muttered, but my companions began to question the possibility that it was all some kind of child's game involving the misuse of flares. However, deep down we all knew that this was not allowed in the area, and that it could definitely be dangerous, both for them and for the whole forest. Those flares could very quickly cause a devastating fire. We decided that we couldn't just stand by and watch and returned to the truck, ready to delve deeper into the darkness of the forest, this time a little further away from the main road. A new flare of fire was seen in the distance, which completely baffled us. It was now located to the northeast, an area that we hadn't explored. As we moved in the direction of the light, we were all aware of the same disturbing question. Who was behind this? When we finally arrived where we thought it would be, the scene was even more discouraging. We found a dark camp, surrounded by 2 hills. The car's lights revealed 2 scattered tents, some forgotten belongings, and an old fire pit where a trail of ashes could still be seen. We looked at each other a little doubtfully, but eventually got out of the vehicle, each of us feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The tents, although visible, looked messy, as if someone had left them in a hurry. It was clear that the place had been abandoned, with equipment, shoes, and backpacks left behind. It didn't even look like the campers had left for a simple excursion, but that something had made them leave in a hurry. At that moment, the feeling that something very strange was happening became very palpable. This was confirmation that a serious danger had been lurking for those who had been there before us. As we checked the area, a chill ran down my spine. One of the tents began to move slightly as if someone were hiding inside. I looked at my friends and terror was reflected on their faces too. We slowly advanced towards the tent, cautiously and expectantly of whatever we might find there. The light from our torches shone in the darkness as the tension grew stronger and stronger. "Is there anyone there?" I shouted. Nobody answered. Only the sound of the wind breaking the silence filled the space. And at that moment I knew that we were involved in something bigger than we had anticipated. Anxiety grew as we got closer, and the realization that we were at the mercy of the unknown began to take shape, terrifying us in its silence. Not knowing what we would find, we advanced towards the tent, feeling that we were about to unravel something dark that could cost us dearly. Finally, we checked the tent, but there was no one there. Just a few scattered things, but no sign of anyone. Searching the camp, I found something that sent a shiver down my spine. A couple of 12-gauge shotgun shells that looked as if they had been fired recently. They were not covered in dust and dirt, as they should be after a long time in the forest, and they still gave off a strong smell of gunpowder. I showed the find to my friends who were exploring the area in search of other clues that would shed light on what had happened to the occupants of that camp, and we all agreed that this was extremely strange. As we searched for more clues, we discovered deep tire marks in the ground, as if someone had left there in a hurry. It was at that moment that I noticed an orange glow emanating from the northern hill overlooking the abandoned camp. I asked Tom to come with me to investigate, and as we climbed the hill, the noise began to intensify. It was a low murmur, but it felt charged with energy. It was very strange. It sounded like a song or a prayer, but it was definitely more than one voice, as if several voices were reciting something in unison. When we reached the top, our torches illuminated a rough and arid valley, very different to the dense foliage that dominated the rest of the forest. Then I saw it. A large circle of hooded figures, dressed in black robes, raising their arms to the sky while vocalizing a low and sinister chant that sent shivers down my spine. At the center of that macabre gathering was a ring of fire, and in the middle of the flames stood an immense black pyramidal structure. I don't know if it was a rock or a charred wooden pyramid. The truth is that it was hard to make out, but it was a sight that seemed to have come straight out of a horror movie. On the periphery, in the shadows, other vehicles could be seen, arranged in such a way that they too seemed to be part of this strange ritual or whatever it was. "What is that, John?" Tom asked, his voice trembling, clearly nervous. I didn't answer him straight away. I was too focused on the chilling spectacle before my eyes. In a moment, the figures raised their arms once more and, taking us by surprise, let out a terrifying scream that echoed in the darkness. At first there was just one, but soon they all joined in, creating a cacophony that threatened to drown out my own thoughts. The adrenaline hit me like a bolt of lightning at that moment, and I was on the verge of screaming. "We have to get out of here right now," I said to Tom in an anxiety-filled whisper. He nodded immediately, and without wasting any more time, we slid down the hill, running to where the others were. My friends looked at us confused, as if our panic was almost funny to them. Tom and I were also laughing, albeit nervously, still in shock at what we had just seen, while they were asking us what had happened up there. However, there was nothing funny about what we saw, and there was no time for giggles or explanations, so we told the guys we had to get back in the van right away and return to the others. We quickly got into the car and returned to the camp. Once we were back on the main road, the horror of what we had seen became even more palpable. From the hills around us, flares lit up the sky, shooting off in succession, and it was as if they were warning us of something, or perhaps signaling to us. The idea that it could be a warning system for the cult we had encountered began to fill me with fear. That night, although exhausted, we stayed alert, armed and ready in case we needed to defend ourselves. At dawn, we packed up our things, feeling the weight of fear that accompanied us. And as I was cleaning up the debris of the camp, I noticed an object on the ground, a small black pyramid that seemed to have appeared there out of nowhere because I definitely hadn't seen it the day before. I picked it up cautiously, feeling that it was a symbol of the darkness we had encountered. I examined it for a moment and realized that it seemed to be made of some kind of rock, and it seemed to give off heat. I was tempted to keep it, but instead I threw it away and told my companions to hurry. At that moment, more than relieved that my friends and I had emerged unscathed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The hooded figures and their creepy ritual kept on haunting my mind. I didn't know what that cult was, or who those people were, if they were recognized rituals or if they were just some crazy people trying to scare unlucky campers like us. As we walked away from the forest, I began to understand that there were strange forces out there, and that what I had witnessed would mark me forever. The idea that the depths of the forest could hold such dark secrets left a bitter taste in my mouth. I didn't know if I could ever look at that place in the same way again, knowing that much more sinister things than we could imagine could be hiding in its shadows. Although I had escaped unharmed, thank God, I knew that there was still a part of me trapped in the flames of that strange ceremony. Who were those cultists? And what were they looking for? With every mile we traveled, a new unknown formed in my mind. There were too many questions crowding my head after seeing what I saw, so I swore that one day I would return to find answers about that dark encounter on that hill. When I was in my second year of university, I was invited to a huge party thrown by some law students at their house. It was one of the wildest parties I've ever been to. If you've ever heard those stories about crazy college parties, I have to tell you that this one fit all the cliches to a T. Kegs everywhere, wet t-shirt contests, couples getting up to no good in the corners, and everything else you can imagine. However, this was not the reason why that party remained in my memory forever, but something much less fun and much more macabre. This happened in 2014 when I was 19 years old. That night, a guy called Michael threw a big party at his beach house. This guy came from a very wealthy family, so it's no surprise that he was very popular at university. But it wasn't just his financial status that made him popular. It was the fact that he had a very wild lifestyle and would spend a lot of money when it came to partying. This guy was about to graduate, and according to him, this was going to be his farewell party for university, so he was going to do it in style. I was very happy to have been invited. In fact, I was quite surprised because not only was I not popular at all, but I was studying at that university thanks to a scholarship, so I didn't have any money either. However, I assumed that the reason they had invited me was because of my friend Eric, who in turn was a friend of Michael's brother. I remember that when I entered the house, the first thing I saw was the host standing on a bar in the middle of the room and dancing to reggaeton, with a lot of very beautiful girls around him. At that moment it was about 10 at night, but Michael already seemed to be quite drunk. I moved to a corner of the room where there was a large beer barrel in which an obese guy was drinking while standing upside down, while two others held him by the legs. I come from a small town, and I was never the most popular person at my school, nor did I often hear about parties. So this was something completely new for me, and I confess that at first I felt quite overwhelmed. But after a couple of beers, the atmosphere began to feel lighter. However, nothing can be perfect, so the beer has a side effect, and that is that it makes your bladder fill up too quickly, so I soon needed to go to the bathroom. I asked where it was, and they pointed to a door at the end of the hall. I went there, but when I opened it, I came face to face with a little couple who were doing their thing there. I closed it again immediately. This house was huge, and there was probably another bathroom, but I didn't think my bladder could take much more, so I ran out of the house and opted for the old reliable, find the nearest tree. I made my way through the crowd, trying to push everyone away as quickly as possible until I finally saw the back door and hurried outside. When I finally made it to the garden, I set off towards the first large tree to hide behind and do my thing, before it was too late. I positioned myself behind the tree, and when I was in the middle of emptying it, I started to hear screams coming from inside the house. At first I thought it was another silly game of drinking from the barrel, or maybe a new round of wet t-shirts, so I didn't think much of it. But then I realized that these weren't just any old screams, as they seemed to be encouraging a fight. I quickly pulled down my fly and ran towards the house as Eric was still there. When I arrived, I could see that there was indeed a fight, as there were a lot of people shouting around, stirring up the situation, and in the background, two men could be heard shouting profanities and hitting each other. But with all the noise, it was impossible to make out the voices. I pushed my way through the crowd as best I could to look for Eric, as I knew his volatile character and his habit of picking fights when he drank, so I wouldn't be at all surprised if he was involved in the fight, and I was not mistaken in my suspicions. When I got close enough, I could see that it was indeed Eric, who was engaged in a brutal fight with none other than the host of the party, that is, Michael, who was a well-built guy and was almost 1.90 meters tall. At that moment, Michael was on top of Eric, who had immobilized him by placing his knees on my friend's biceps and was beating him in the face with great brutality. Although I could see that he also had significant injuries on his face, so surely Eric had also given him his share. Seeing what this guy was doing to my friend, I instinctively ran towards them and tried to get Michael off him. But someone grabbed me by the shirt and pulled me back, causing me to fall backwards onto the ground. I tried to get up, but they prevented me from doing so, while that almost 2-meter-tall beast continued to brutally beat my friend. I have never been the best fighter in the world. In fact, I had never been in a fight. But at that moment, I started to throw punches and kicks at anyone who tried to stop me helping my friend, who was clearly at a disadvantage at that moment. But fortunately, at that moment, the sound of a siren was heard, which made everyone start running, and the fight dissipated. In the same way, Michael also ran out of the house to avoid being arrested, finally releasing Eric. At that moment, I instinctively wanted to run, but then I realized that my friend was still on the floor, so I ran over to him with the intention of carrying him and taking him out of there. But when I finally reached him, I was very shocked. Eric was totally unrecognizable. His face was completely swollen and seriously lacerated from all the blows he had received, and he was barely conscious. As best I could, I put one of his arms around my shoulders and held him, while with my other arm I rolled his torso so that I could hold him tight and carry him with me. As I walked at a snail's pace with my friend lying outside the house, I thought we would inevitably be caught. But fortunately, the police were very busy with a few kids they had caught running away in the garden. So I went out the back door as fast as I could, with the good luck that another friend from university was just about to drive away, and when he saw us, he got out and helped me get Eric into the back of his truck, and then we all drove to my apartment. Once we were safe in my apartment, our friend helped me carry Eric and lay him on the sofa. He was conscious, but in a pretty bad way, so I strongly insisted that we go to the hospital, but he completely refused, saying that he was fine and that they were just a couple of scratches. But I was looking at him straight on, and I knew that they weren't just a couple of scratches. His face was seriously injured and he definitely needed medical help, but he flatly refused, and well, being of sound mind, we couldn't force him, so we just started cleaning his face with towels and alcohol, as well as giving him a couple of painkillers for the pain. Once his face was clean of all the blood it had previously, we could see more clearly the extent of the damage he had suffered. Eric was really unrecognizable with all the wounds and swelling. Once again, I insisted that he go to the doctor, but he flatly refused. Instead, he asked me if I had any suturing equipment in my first aid kit, and luckily there was one. But I warned him that I didn't know how to suture. And to my surprise, Eric replied that he did. So he limped to the bathroom and sutured his wounds himself. At that moment, it was about 12:30 at night. It was still early. It was a pity that the party had been ruined like that. After checking that Eric was out of danger, Gabriel, the friend who had driven us to my apartment, went home, and before leaving I thanked him and my friend profusely for their kind gesture. After that, Eric insisted that he wanted to go to his residence, but after arguing with him for a while, he finally agreed to stay at my apartment as I convinced him that he was in no condition to be out on the street, especially at that time of night. I insisted that he sleep in my bed so that he would be more comfortable, while I stayed in the living room. But he did not accept and preferred to sleep on the sofa. Eric was an extremely stubborn and headstrong guy, so I didn't say anything else to him. At least I knew he was safe in my apartment. The next morning, I woke up a little later than usual. Probably because of all the stress of the previous night, I walked to the living room and saw that my friend was still asleep. His face looked really bad, but other than that, he seemed fine. I went to the kitchen to make a coffee, when suddenly I started to hear loud bangs on the door. The banging was very insistent, so I went over and asked who it was in case Michael had come to seek revenge. But it was Gabriel, and he sounded very desperate, so I opened the door quickly. He burst in and said in an alarmed voice, "Have you heard what happened yet?" Eric, who had woken up to the banging on the door, and I looked at each other and then at Gabriel, and obviously we told him that we didn't know, so he said, "Michael is dead." My friend and I were silent for a moment until I asked Gabriel what he was talking about. How is he dead? How did it happen? Gabriel went on to tell us that the maid at the beach house had found Michael's lifeless body that morning lying on the sofa and covered in blood. Someone had stabbed him 17 times while he was sleeping, apparently with a butcher's knife that had been taken from the kitchen of the house itself, which had not yet been found. And now everyone believed that the murderer was Eric. Gabriel said he had been calling us all morning, but neither of us answered the cell phone, so I explained that mine was dead. And Eric's probably fell in the house when he had the fight. When we realized this, we all looked at each other and fell silent because the fact that his phone was there was evidence against him. But of course we knew that Eric was not the murderer. He had spent the night in my apartment, and in his condition he hadn't moved anywhere. But who could have done such a thing? That was the first thing I asked myself, of course. A few minutes later, we heard the sound of a patrol car at the entrance to the building, and by then it was clear to us who they were looking for. A few minutes later, there was a knock on my door. It was 2 police officers. They took Eric away for questioning while Gabriel and I were summoned to make statements. To summarize a little, I will tell you that the case of Michael's murder was a complete labyrinth for the police, as their main suspect was Eric. But he had a solid alibi, and beyond the blood on his shirt and the phone in the house, which obviously was due to the fight, they found no real evidence to incriminate him. Aside from his argument with Michael that night, they also didn't find the murder weapon. And after interviewing half the campus, they basically had nothing. No one had any idea who could have done such a thing. The case eventually went cold, and this terrifying crime remained a complete mystery. Until 7 years later, the truth came to light and it left everyone completely frozen. By then, I had already graduated, moved to another city, and eventually lost contact with my former university classmates, including Eric and Gabriel. But one day, while I was organizing a pile of papers, I received a very unexpected call from Gabriel, whom I hadn't spoken to in about 2 years. I answered the call and greeted him with an effusive, "Hey bro, to what do I owe this pleasant surprise?" He just replied, "Have you seen the news?" At that moment, I was speechless because the truth is that I didn't usually watch the news, so I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. Then he sent a link to my phone, and when I opened it, I was completely stunned. It was the link to a local news program from our hometown, And on it, the presenter was saying that one of the unsolved crimes that had most shocked the city had finally been solved. It was the Michael case. It turns out that shortly before, a neighbor of the beach house where the fatal event had occurred found a butcher's knife buried in his garden, wrapped in a plastic bag, while he was doing gardening work. The man logically called the police, and they determined that it was the weapon used to take Michael's life. And after a laboratory analysis, they discovered that it had Eric's fingerprints on it, as well as traces of his own blood. He was later arrested and finally confessed to the crime. I must confess that when I heard the news, I was completely shocked. I couldn't believe what I was seeing and hearing at that moment. Eric confessed that around 2 a.m. after I went to sleep, he took the keys to my apartment, opened the door, and walked to Michael's house, which wasn't far away. According to him, his intention was to get his cell phone back. Luckily for him, the back door to the house was unlocked, so he took the opportunity to go inside thinking it would be empty. But when he went into the living room, he found Michael fast asleep on the sofa, probably too drunk to realize there was an intruder in the house. It was then that he remembered what had happened, and he was filled with rage, especially when he looked at himself in the mirror, because he saw that his face had suffered very severe damage, which would leave him scarred for life. So full of fury, he went to the kitchen, took the biggest knife he could find, and lunged at Michael's body, who had no chance to defend himself. After his confession, Eric was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. I must tell you that this event had a great impact on my life because I really never imagined that my friend was capable of doing something so horrible. It reminded me that we never know someone completely and that everyone has a dark side, but I also liked knowing that justice was finally done.